We're joined now by our political panel. Margaret Brennan is CBS News White House and senior foreign affairs correspondent. David Ignatius is a columnist at the Washington Post. Michael Crowley is Politico's senior foreign affairs correspondent. And David Nakamura covers the White House for the Washington Post. Margaret, I want to start with you. Welcome back from the trip. What was the administration's view of this meeting with Russian President Putin?
Well, the administration believes now that they've checked the box. They've handled the issue of Russian hacking by speaking directly to Vladimir Putin. The only account of that meeting was described to us by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. He was the only other administration official in that very small meeting. And as described by Russian officials in their on-camera press conferences, both from their foreign minister and Vladimir Putin, they said President Trump accepted their denials and that agreed to move forward. Secretary Tillerson says, well, yeah, we agreed to move forward. And the majority of the meeting then went on, he says, to focus in on this first test of U.S.-Russian cooperation in Syria and this limited ceasefire in the south of the country that went into effect today.
I want to get back to that Syria in a moment, but David Nakamura, you wrote about this week other presidents who'd met with President Putin continue to put this meeting in the context of history.
Well, you know, I think what's interesting is Putin has sort of really soured on U.S. relations. We know that under President Obama at the end of George W. Bush, they had tried to get off to a better start, but he was very frustrated, and he was known from the people I talked to begin meetings with a litany of complaints about U.S. actions undermining Russian cooperation. I think there was a little bit of a different element here at play where he sort of recognized the challenges that Donald Trump is under politically, and to some degree, it's interesting. We don't know who set up the terms of this meeting, the so few participants, and the idea that both sides came out spinning sort of proactively on their behalf. But what we do know is that President Putin has gone on camera and had, as Margaret said, a press conference, and Foreign Minister Lavrov has as well. The U.S. side has not done that. You have senior administration officials, some on the record, some not, disputing some of Putin's characteristics of this meeting. But this morning you have Donald Trump again saying that the Russian leader denied it, denied the meddling, but that I, Donald Trump, have already said what I have to say about this. Let's move on. And that's just not enough.
David Ignatius, the president seems from his tweet this morning to want to move on from this question of interference. Senator McCain says if you move on and the Russians pay no consequences, they'll be emboldened. That's certainly the way presidential candidate Donald Trump talked about it. It's the way Secretary of State Tillerson talked about it at his confirmation hearing. If they see weakness, they're emboldened. What do you make of the kind of state of play right now with respect to this interference?
Sanctions against Russia are still in place. Contrary to what Senator McCain said, President Obama did impose additional sanctions for the hacking on December 29, expelling Russian diplomats, closing 2 of their compounds. Those are not, so far as we know, being returned. They're still in place. So there are no additional sanctions for now, but none were taken off as a result of this meeting. This summit was just fascinating to see the U.S., the former President Trump, so isolated from our traditional allies, where people were talking about the G19 versus the U.S. on climate change, and then this extraordinary rapprochement with Vladimir Putin, accused by our intelligence agencies of attacking our elections, and the president basically saying, it's time to move on. We won't move on until Robert Mueller has delivered his investigative report. That's what's going to resolve this, along with the congressional hearings.
Right, and even go ahead, Margaret.
I would say, to your point, one of the best sort of contrasts to this would be to look at the French president when he met with Vladimir Putin, who, yes, they had a meeting, let's talk about working together, but in public came out and directly said, I don't like where they are on human rights, persecution of gays, issues of election hacking, etc., and stood up to at least say, here are our values that we don't like you undermining. Secretary Tillerson, on the other hand, described this meeting and chemistry between President Trump and Putin as positive. They couldn't stop talking. The First Lady had to barge into the room to say, can you wrap up the meeting? And then they kept talking for another hour. The optics are troubling to our European allies because of that degree of positive chemistry.
And Michael Crowley, this morning the president is tweeting about this cybersecurity unit that's getting some tough reviews. Senator Rubio tweeted, partnering with Putin on a cybersecurity unit is akin to partnering with Assad, the leader of Syria, on a chemical weapons unit.
Yeah. Well, or one thought I had would be a maritime security cooperation arrangement with the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. I mean, they came in, the Russians hit us really hard. It's not clear whether they were able to influence the outcome of the election. We know that there was the integrity of the vote. Votes were not changed. But I think despite Trump's repeated assertions, you can't say for sure that the Russian propaganda that made its way into the U.S. and the theft and release of embarrassing emails from the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign, you can't say that they played no role. So I think that it's very troubling for a lot of people in Washington, in the Congress, possibly even in Trump's own administration, to see his response to this is we need to work together. And John, I would add that in that press conference that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had when he talked about this, he said that, you know, as we move forward and we have this cooperative relationship, both sides are agreeing not to interfere in each other's affairs, which I think is a real concession to Vladimir Putin, who feels that Hillary Clinton helped to mastermind popular protests against him in 2011. And indeed, many people believe that created a grudge where Putin was out to get revenge against Hillary. There's basically no evidence that the State Department or the U.S. government whipped up those protests. That was genuine popular dissent. This is essentially a Kremlin myth that Tillerson and Trump may have implicitly endorsed.
David, one thing that seems confusing here in terms of the president's posture is, on the one hand, he blames President Obama for having choked, having not held the Russians to account for this interference in the election. But now the president would like to move on and is forming a cyber unit in cooperation with the Russians. I mean,
it's political jiu-jitsu, and he blamed, right on this trip, he blamed President Obama again for not doing enough. So he wants to have it both ways, and that's not going to satisfy people on Capitol Hill or others in the media who I think really want to see not only Robert Mueller's investigation play out, but also whether the president will take accountability and follow up on some of the, sort of additional sanctions that some in Congress are pushing.
David Ignatius, the Syria agreement, and Margaret, I want to get your take on this too. So that's one of the things that came out of this meeting, but also we have what the Secretary of State said about Syria, which is, again, he said, by and large, our objectives, he's talking about the Russians here, are exactly the same. How we get there, we each have a view. Maybe they, meaning the Russians, have got the right approach, and we've got the wrong approach.
I have no idea what Tillerson meant by that. It's a strange comment, and Senator McCain was right. The Russians have been associated with an absolutely barbaric campaign by President Bashar al-Assad. Tillerson also said that the U.S. expects, and it was implied that the U.S. and Russia expect, that President Assad will leave as part of a transition, and that the Assad family will leave power as this transition moves forward. I've just been in Syria 2 weeks ago, and what's obvious is that there is movement with the U.S. and Russia working together toward deconfliction, de-escalation, identification of the different parts of the country where there can be truces in effect. People stand down. That's real. It's been happening for weeks. And the reason that I have some confidence that this may have legs is because they've been testing it. One deconfliction line for the last 3 weeks. The agreement in the Southwest that Margaret made reference to actually was reached about a week ago, and they've been watching to see if it holds, and when it held, they decided to announce it. So maybe there is something there.
Margaret, what's your take?
And negotiated by American diplomats. Not necessarily in that room between the two heads of state. But what I think is interesting here is it's being presented as a test. But this is also a test of Russia in terms of can they actually influence and control Assad and the Iranian forces that are on the ground, because we don't negotiate as the United States government with either the Assad regime or with Iran. So paper agreements are nice. Let's see what happens. But as David was just saying, this has been tested. In some ways, this could be a lifeline for the U.S.-backed opposition in that particular part of the country. It could also be something that allows them to hold on to the governance structures that they've started to establish there. That might be a blueprint for the future, but it is so heavily caveated with, can anyone actually enforce this, that we'll have to see what happens.
All right, we're going to pause there. We'll be back in a moment with our panel on North Korea and healthcare. Stay with us.